Hello, and welcome to the Specialty Matcha Podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun, who also goes by Sam,
Hello, hello.
and we're the co-founders of Senko Matcha Products.
Yeah, we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, or should we call it mocha or malcha or powder green tea, Ryan? And share startup stories and interview experts. But today's topic will mainly be on, the very name of this green powder that has
Yeah.
been debated over and over again by many people with different point of view.
So we want to have a somewhat fresh take, but it's pretty like hot online topic in discourse about one, what is the definition of matcha? What is real and fake? And like what the word matcha even means now. And I think it's worth asking, is matcha just a format now versus something that needs a very strict definition? So this is sort of debate style, discussion style topic between Sam and I, Jungjun and I, about sort of our thoughts and the different perspectives that we've heard. Because I think you can
Yeah,
legitimately argue like very different sides of this depending on what you care about and what you prioritize first, like the consumer, the culture, the history, the legacy, whether or not you care about small brands, whether or not you care about innovation. And there's all these different lenses you can put on it, which makes it a really interesting podcast topic.
yes, indeed. And Ryan and I have been actually debating over this topic over and over again in the past few years. And our perspective has shifted a little bit to different spectrums, but largely we're still in a I would say fairly intense disagreement at the moment still. So which makes this podcast I think will be very interesting.
Yeah. So let's
Mm.
start inwards and zoom out. And one of the things that prompted this is one of our good industry friends, Jules Reyes, put out a reel where she was discussing some Chinese matcha that she was drinking, or Chinese mocha, if you are in that camp, and was asking her audience what people thought about matcha coming from places outside of Japan. And a really prominent, well-known producer in Wazuka in Kyoto Prefecture commented that they said something that we've heard over and over in the matcha industry is that matcha is like champagne. If it's not grown in Champagne, it cannot be called champagne. And that Japan has done a very bad job protecting it, but anything coming out of Japan should be green tea powder. So, Sam, how would you interpret that comment sort of at face value? And then we can kind of zoom out from there.
Yeah, we Chinese didn't do a good job protecting mocha. That's why it got to Japan. Actually, intellectually, I agree with him. This Japanese tea producers. I mean, like, it's really in the name, matcha. That's a Japanese name for a very much Japanese product. And, I have always been advocating for using a different term, either whether or not it's mocha or malcha in Korean or whatever language that you're speaking in your local area to kind of bucket this powder green tea format tea underneath this new name or a different name other than matcha. But, realistically speaking, it's really not that actionable. Like from a, consumer perception and recognition point of view, pushing out a new name just makes things more confusing for everybody. And there's no regulatory entity to enforce that. And you are just introducing another confusing term into this already chaotic environment. Um, but intellectually speaking, matcha is really it's matcha, right? It's you're literally pronouncing a Japanese words when you speak matcha.
Yes, but you can also argue the other side. So let's talk about the semantic argument for matcha, or what the words actually mean and where they came from.
Originally, it came from mocha, the Chinese term for powder tea, and then in Japanese kanji they add a hand radical to signify that this powder format is powderized by hand, which was implying the usage of ishiyuzu, which was powered by hand back in the days.
Mm.
That's the evolution of the semantic meaning of these names. But if you really date back to the origin, it's mocha, right? It's powdered tea.
And
But
it's a descriptive
also,
name,
like
like literally powdered or rubbed tea.
that's right. But also, like if you really trace back to the origin, that was very vague from the very beginning. People in Song Dynasty didn't just drink like pure tea. Like it's there's still some mixture of some other ingredients. And if you date back to Tang Dynasty, which is the previous dynasty before Song Dynasty, where people also were drinking powder tea, they were adding like gingers and mountain junipers and all kinds of things into the tea soup. It really was a soup at the time. And that was also in the powder format. It's powder tea. It's still mocha. And it just gets, evolved into, what nowadays people are perceiving what matcha is. Like if you trace back the lineage, it's there isn't a clear cut of what is truly the most traditional or the most pure or the most right version of this tea format.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, if you take a can of like Maruku Koyama and back to someone studying before Rikyu's time, let's say 100 years before Rikyu, who was drinking matcha, matcha wasn't shaded at that point. It was
Mm.
likely not shaded. It would be almost an unrecognizable product, even within Japan, taken out of its time and out of its context. So the very meaning and understanding of what matcha is fluid and has changed throughout the centuries and actually even throughout the millennia. That the history goes back that far. So semantically, speaking, it is a descriptive name. It literally just means powdered tea. Now, you can argue the other side of this too, that at any time and place and context, everyone has an idea of what certain words mean, right? Everyone has an idea of what champagne tastes like. And a wine produced outside of the Champagne region may or may not live up to those expectations and that someone gets when they think that they are purchasing or drinking champagne. And same can be true for matcha, right? The idea of matcha as a product and part of the reason it's gotten famous globally are because of its color. A lot of people have expectations around its health benefits. A lot of people have expectations around the taste. And if you deliver a product that might deviate from any of these things that meet consumers' expectations, it can drag down the whole industry. Now, is it fair that a Japanese tea producer is calling all Chinese matcha essentially fake and that it's green tea powder? I don't know. Actually, a lot of the Chinese made product is made with Japanese cultivars, Japanese processing equipment,
And even
and
Japanese people
and by Japanese people in
sometimes.
some cases, and milled on Japanese ishiyusu in China, which we know exists. And the more you learn about matcha and matcha-like production and speak about experts in agriculture, you learned that, matcha is significantly less terroir-driven than other teas, because there's so much human intervention. The impact of fertilizer, the impact of shading, the impact of cultivar, and the impact of processing. So long as you're able to replicate these things, the terroir, so long as you're not killing the plant, actually matters significantly less than if we're talking about, other types of tea or even other types of crops. So the ability to dislocate where it is grown to replicate that product, there's no fundamental reason why it can't be done. So it's, is it fair to call a product that is grown in China, that is processed on the same equipment from the same cultivars, with intervention from people that have the same knowledge, Japanese people doing work in China with the same or similar fertilizers and milled on similar equipment, fake? I don't know. I think that's a bit disingenuous, actually. But if you're comparing it to just some random green tea powder crap that was not shaded at all and then, quickly ball milled from non-Japanese cultivars, yeah, that's bastardizing. But you deliver that to a consumer and you call it matcha, it brings down the whole industry. But on the other hand, if we were to bring one of these high-end Chinese matcha, especially one that we recently had, to this producer, I would be a little bit surprised if they would be able to identify it as a non-Japanese product.
Oh, I would be very surprised. It's better than a lot of the mid-tier, lower-tier Japanese matcha from like Shizuoka or Kagoshima that I have tried before.
Yeah, significantly better, actually. And made
So
from a Japanese company with roots in Uji, no less, but produced in mainland China. That's like the semantic side of this debate, but we're still talking about tea that comes from tencha, right? So the processing is still very similar. But Sungjin, what if we zoom out and talk about tea that is milled into a matcha-like consistency from non-tencha? Is it fair to call that matcha, like Gokuro matcha? Is that like a fair description?
I
Are we just
think
at a
well, I think from the Japanese perspective, they already made a decision. They will not call a hojicha powder hojicha matcha or matcha, black matcha, dark matcha, or brown matcha. Like they call it hojicha powder. And I think well, that's a interesting judgment framework if we want to borrow that. Like if we kind of strictly adhere to the current definition of what matcha should be. It should be a powder that's coming from tencha, not from any other format of tea base material. But on the other hand, how would you enforce that definition to consumers when they understand a definition? It's very difficult to kind of re-educate them into understanding some other things. Like it's just adding confusions into a already low awareness or growing awareness market. And you have all these discourse constantly fighting for each other. And obviously, like if you use the term matcha, it's like people trying to use the term ceremonial grade. It's trying to imply for a higher quality or a matcha-like product. Like people are naturally incentivized to use a more premium term to describe their product.
yeah, natural path of incentive. So, I mean, it is going to happen. And I've seen a lot of just very famous and respected or even upstart tea companies that will label things as like Gokuro matcha, for example. And like if
Mm.
going back to the episode that we recorded with Mark and Jules, both formerly of Jade Leaf Matcha, one of the really early predominant e-commerce matcha brands in the United States, he said something interesting, and it really stuck with me. He said, marketers will say and do whatever they want. And it's just a reality of the world. And, the
Yep.
majority of that person's job is to get someone to understand something in 2 seconds. The cost of customer acquisition is not free. If you're a tea company or any company for that matter, finding someone who will buy the thing that you're selling costs money and costs time. And any layers of complication that you put on top of that is a barrier that you're putting up for yourself. And if you're a random upstart tea company in, let's say, Germany, and you're labeling your milled Gokuro product as Gokuro matcha, um, and you're sourcing it from a producer in Japan, right? Like, it's just going to get across much faster about what it is to someone than calling it just like Gokuro powder, or Gokuro is a word that the average German consumer might not know. The matcha is definitely a word that the average person knows, and it's still honest. And, quite frankly, the person that they're buying it from might literally have it labeled as Gokuro matcha on their catalog from a Japanese producer themselves. So, like, you can't fault that person.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And now you even have brands like Me, who has a very long and descriptive page kind of defining different grades of matcha,
You
and
know,
different styles of matcha. But, like, they're even saying, like, Midori matcha is anything from powdered non-tencha leaves, so they're defining it. But they're still using the term matcha because it instantly communicates, or oolong matcha, or roasted matcha, which they put in parentheses is hojicha powder, or black tea matcha, etc. And they have many of these different things, and just communicating something as matcha just gets the idea across so much faster. It's arguably much better for consumers to just
for
instantly.
now, I guess. Actually, interesting thought, kind of a segue from the current conversation, but still related. I think marketers are doing so because matcha is really, what consumer knows for the moment, and it's the only term that people would use to imply for a higher quality product. But I think that might change in the future, especially if we continue to see the quality of Chinese matcha increase in the future. The tendency of people trying to use a unique word to kind of differentiate their own product from a product that's made from somewhere else will be much higher. in the future. We actually saw this happen for baijiu. It's the Chinese liquor. They used to just call it Chinese vodka or Chinese grain spirits. They're trying to use a term that people will understand from the Western perspective to describe the product. They're calling it baijiu. They're marketing it as baijiu, and baijiu is getting recognized in a global context. And I think that might happen in the future if the quality of powder green tea or Chinese matcha continue to increase, and there are more, um, you know, uh, either processing or farming technique or farming culture or cultivar uh, that emerge as more uniquely Chinese versus adopting technology or technique from Japan. I think this might actually happen at some point, and mocha will become a new term that implies for something that's uniquely Chinese and also equivalently high quality.
Yeah, and there's a lot of incentive for people to do that.
Like it's like champagne, other places call it sparkling wine, but in Spain they call it cava, and people are perfectly fine with that. It also implies for a very uniquely Spanish product that is
Mm.
champagne liked.
The problem is, though, within the case of China, is that there's a huge economic incentive to make imitation, what I'll call an imitation product, which it
For
sounds like
now.
there's a lot of judgment. No, 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 no. But I'm saying there's always going to be two camps, right? You're developing two very similar products. There can be some producers in China that are doing innovation in their own thing and like leaning maybe more into different processing techniques or Chinese cultivars, et cetera. But on the other side, right, there's going to still be people that are trying to create what they're creating in Japan. And that's an imitation product. It's like everything about that recipe, that tencha creation, and then matcha creation is what people know and would associate with as matcha. So then
Yeah.
where do you draw that line?
Well, it might be confusing for the near term, but in the future it might not as be as you might expect it. I give you another example, Ryan. The term whiskey spells differently in Ireland and in the UK. The difference is missing e. Honestly, there's no like that much fundamental difference between whiskey making in Ireland versus whiskey making in Scotland. But they are different enough name. There's a difference of one character. And it's an interesting comparison if you compare the kanji between matcha and mocha. It's basically the same kanji with just a different radical, and they're historically related too. And now people perceive them as a very distinctive product based on their geolocation and the cultural lineage and history lineage of both products.
That there'll always be people in China that are trying to produce a Japanese-like product, and there might be some people like geolocation, like, almost doesn't fit. It's, like, more of a style or category creation, and then even within that category creation of, let's call it, a Chinese mocha renaissance, where they really start developing their own categories, gonna have enormous variation. Right? If you're just looking at the product itself, right? There's going to be product that is distinctly Chinese with Chinese characteristics in its taste and in its processing and in the people who made it. And there's going to be products that are distinctly Japanese in its processing and characteristics
I think
that are both being produced in China.
these champagne producers and cover producers, they learn from each other all the time. Irish whiskey producers and Scottish whiskey producers, they learn from each other all the time. And I think the same thing will happen between Chinese matcha or mocha in the future and Japanese matcha. I think that the incentive is that the producers want to make a difference in the future. Right now, they're kind of taking a ride from this Japanese matcha hype and calling it Chinese matcha. But as in the future, when there's a distinctive style and culture being formed eventually in China, and I think it will happen. I think people will naturally want to call their product differently.
Yeah, maybe. But then it's even more confusing for consumers. And
It
then
may or may not like that. Then it will. I think it will be like if you really want a specialty movement to happen or a fertile soil for specialty. I think making distinction is important, and I think people would love to learn about that. And it's easier, I think, for people to remember or to recognize the product from a different area if the name itself is
I mean, what do we call this? The powdered tea industry? Like, if we look at the coffee industry or
different.
the chocolate industry, right? It's not ca or the wine industry, like, you don't call it by 1,000 different things. Like, it's like the matcha is, like, really forming its own very distinct category with consumers who love it as a coffee replacement, as a non-coffee replacement, right? Like, it even lives outside of the realm of tea a little bit in consumers' like, it's pretty interesting. We get trapped in this bubble of people who know and have a very opinionated about matcha, and I really love opinionated people. I find exploring these perspectives, like, just fascinating, from just like a like almost an anthropology perspective. But I was
Mhm.
talking I was in New Year's, Eve, with my girlfriend's, friend group in Brittany in France, and there were about 10 other French people at this New Year's Eve party, and was chatting with some people. And, it's just shocking. Like, these are all people, a lot of them live in Paris or in some other French city, and, we're all the same age. We're all around, 30 plus years old. Everyone has a decent amount of international experience. Actually, French people in general are much more likely to have international experience than other people because, at least at their university that they all went to and met at, it's mandatory to spend 6 months abroad, and if you don't wanna explore, those people go to Belgium, 'cause or French-speaking part of Belgium, but, a lot of other people went to Japan, Costa Rica, the US, like, all over. Right, so these are, like, pretty decently traveled people, and we were talking about matcha. Most people here have no idea it's a Japanese product, which is, like, shock and most of her friends work in agriculture, and so that's really weird. And not everyone knows that it's tea, right? Like, where the average consumer is at is it's very different than I think where the bleeding edge of this conversation trying to define what matcha is, right? Like, it is almost new category formation for a lot of people. The vast
Mm.
majority of people, right? You have matcha, you have coffee, you have chai. And, like, where those things intersect and what they have in common is, I think, less clear in those people's minds than we all like to think.
I think this complication already exists for tea, and it's already embedded in a lot of languages in the world. Like, if you look around the world, like how do different languages call this very plant Camellia sinensis? Like some people call them chai, some people call them te, or any variations of te. Actually, it can all be traced back to how Chinese call this tea originally in China from different regions. Like all of the tea calling customs can be traced back to Hokkien, which the local Hokkien people call tea te, and all of the cha calling culture can be traced back to southern China or northern China through the Silk Road that's routing through the land versus if you route it through Hokkien, it's from the sea. So from the land culture, it's all cha or chai or any variations of that. So it's already, a pretty confusing name to begin with for the plant itself. And I think this might also exist for matcha or mocha in the future. People will eventually just pick a side
Mm. Pick a side or use both. I don't know. It's
or
a bit
use both
messy.
or use both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then you have the legal side, right? If we talk about, like, legal definitions for food categorization, right? Like, one of the only rules in, like, Japan is that it has to be made from tencha. But even this rule we've heard, is frequently violated, especially for a lot of the mass market matcha products coming out of Japan, where there's a significant amount of what's called mogacha, which is like almost tencha. It's tencha that's not processed in a tencha factory, but it's processed on sencha processing equipment. They just turn off the rolling function, which apparently gets blended in all of the time to stuff that gets labeled as matcha. And so even
Mm.
within, the country of Japan, you have quote unquote fake matcha being sold as matcha, let alone having also other countries' tencha getting blended into those products too, violating even the Japanese farmers' complaint or perspective
Mm.
that anything outside of Japan should not be considered matcha. There's a big collective problem, not only the broader community, but also I think within Japan. And this legal status of what can be sold as matcha doesn't exist in Japan. It doesn't appear to be really enforced in Japan. And I don't see it happening anywhere else in the world either for what can be legally sold as matcha. Because
Yeah.
how in the world could you enforce it? They can't if you
Yeah.
can't enforce it in Japan, if someone like the government of Thailand or the European Union stepped in and said, "Okay, we're having a strict definition for matcha. It has to come from Japan, has to come from Tencha, and it has to be shaded for this number of days and only come from these cultivars." You could never it'd be so difficult to enforce if, even the Japanese are blending in mogacha or Chinese tencha into their own products.
Yeah, very true. Very true. I mean, there's no regulatory entity to enforce any of these ideas or ideologies that people imposed onto this product. And I think there's very little thing that anyone can do about it. I'm a little more pessimistic on this end. Maybe pessimistic is the wrong word. I actually pretty neutral in terms of how matcha is being used freely by different parties. I mean, like in reality, it has transcended its cultural and language context. It's no longer in anyone's control, and no one has any power to really do anything about it. I mean, intellectually speaking, I think matcha is inherently Japanese. It's in its name. It's a Japanese term, but realistically speaking, I think there's very little things that anyone can do about.
Yeah, and even if you were to geo-restrict what you call and like what you would call matcha, like China maybe gets a pass because there's a Chinese legacy and tradition of mocha in China. But what about tencha that gets converted into matcha or some type of imagine a world where like what is it called when you produce tencha in the north of Thailand and grind it into a powder, or in northern Vietnam, or if what if Myanmar starts producing tencha, or other countries? What about Korea? I mean, they have their word malcha, but then what do you call it? Like that would be super weird. Like you have the exact recipe for tencha being produced in northern Thailand, let's say. To our knowledge, there's a few people doing it. So then what do you do?
They all can use the name Mocha. I give them the pass.
But and then you have, like, actual behavior, right? Like, words are kind of strange because they're outside of people's control. You can try to enforce it, but the enforcement, I think, always needs to be top down. There has to be some authority that says, "Okay, champagne, we're recognizing this as it must be grown within the region that the French government determines is champagne." And every single country on earth goes with this, has to comply in that as well. It actually, in the case of Russia, I think maybe North Korea too. I don't know, but I know Russia for sure is one of the only major countries that doesn't has never honored champagne as a what we'll call like protected single origin because Stalin loved champagne and they started making some within the USSR. And typically, it's actually incredibly sweet. So, if you go to Russia, a couple of years ago in 2019, I spent 2 weeks in Russia doing consumer research for food and beverage preferences. And the idea of champagne, that word in Russia, has taken on a very different meaning to the average consumer there. To them, it is this sweet, sparkly wine.
Mm.
And that's what it's been since the time of Stalin, who loved champagne and loves specifically loves sweet champagne. That word has taken on an entirely new meaning in a place where it is outside of its context, right? So it's you know,
Ryan, like it already happened once. When the matcha gets transferred into Japan,
yeah,
Japanese matcha does not taste like what matcha tastes like back in the days in China. Like the judgment of high quality is thick foam and as white or as pale as possible. Um, back in Song Dynasty,
mm,
it's not the same. Like not how the Japanese would appreciate for matcha. Even since the days of Rikyu, it's a different product. It's a Russian champagne for the Chinese.
even the words have been used and abused throughout time, especially if you look into Korean tea history. would use the character cha, the Chinese character cha for tea. And for a lot of tea scholars, it's actually pretty confusing. And to my knowledge, the same within ancient Chinese texts is that tea is actually a very general term, especially during when you reference the Joseon dynasty. When they use the character cha, it does not imply that it came from Camellia sinensis. It could be any like hot herbal infusion. I mean, this is still true to this day, where you have these very generic words that kind of blur boundaries, but people kind of understand what it means, but it gets used and abused because technically it can't be tea unless it comes from the tea plant, Camellia sinensis. But all throughout history, actually, people have been abusing and using this word to communicate some type of herbal infusion. Right? So it's not even
Mm.
unique to matcha.
Yeah, it's not unique to Korea either. People in China do it all the time too. Usually, we would add a prefix like something something cha. Like if it's mulberry leaf, we call it sangye cha. People still make a difference, but back in the ancient time, like the tea Bible Chajing, actually there was a difference, and some of the usage of those old terms still exist today. So the sweeter Camellia sinensis has a unique name called Ming, and the more bitter Camellia sinensis has a different character called Tu, and 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 people still use those characters nowadays. Ming is more popular, Tu less so. But
Is it refer to cultivar or processing? What is makes it sweeter or more bitter?
I think from what I have read from Chajing, it's probably referring to the cultivar. Like Lu Yu was talking about, some tea tastes naturally sweeter, some tea tastes naturally more bitter.
For our audience, Sam, who might be less versed in general tea history, you want to talk a little bit about Lu Yu and about Chajing?
So Chajing or Tea Bible is written by this scholar called Lu Yu, who lives back in the Tang Dynasty, and it was the first codified text that kind of consolidate the usage of farming tea, processing tea, consuming tea, also preparing tea, and all of the culture and utensils related to tea preparation. In the history, when people kind of trying to trace back the lineage of any tea cultures or tea consumptions habit in history in different areas, this is oftentimes the reference of the origin.
Yeah, it's like the documentation of the first tea culture ever existed.
Yeah, codified tea culture, and certainly it has a lot of differences compared to how tea is consumed today in China or in any other countries in the world. But it's a pretty interesting time machine that we can kind of see how even the very term for tea evolves throughout time. And it's actually quite a short book to read. Even for the translation version, you can probably finish it in like 1 or 2 hours. So I strongly encourage everyone to read it at least once.
Indeed. And there's a great scholar, a great blog, if you want to learn more about this, in the US. His name's Stephen Ouyang, that does a lot of translations with a lot of footnotes of Chajing, the so-called tea Bible, written in the Tang
Mm.
Dynasty, to bring a lot of context, because apparently it's very difficult
Yeah,
to read if you don't have the references for a lot of what is referenced.
but it's very interesting. Like when if you do read it, you would be surprised how much similar people care about tea back in the days versus how people caring about the terroir, caring about the water, caring about the cultivar, the climate. Lu Yu was writing things that he cared about like the same way as we care about tea today. He talks about different tea being grown in different areas and how is that impact the taste of the tea, and what kind of water is the best for tea. He actually has a ranking of how to harvest your water in different
Yeah.
areas, and which one is more suitable for tea consumption, and different utensils, how do you use that for tea preparations, and how do you judge from the appearance of the tea to judge its quality, and all sorts of interesting things. And it's exactly how people would care about for a specialty product nowadays.
Yeah, really aged well. First how-to guide, comprehensive guide to making delicious tea.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And that was it was written like some like 700 AD.
Yeah,
So
wow,
that's
like,
like
1,300 years ago.
yeah, 1500 years ago, 1200 years ago, 1300 years ago. Uh,
millennia ago, at least.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Pretty crazy.
It is pretty crazy.
But yeah, Ryan, I mean, like the definition for tea, like we're talking about the definition for matcha being fluid, but the definition for tea itself was fluid since the very beginning.
Still is.
And yeah, very true, very true. And somehow, not only the cultivation and the consumption being localized in all these areas, it even got localized in their languages, and I think it's really a beautiful thing. And I think that fundamentally different. Um, there's no fundamental difference of how people adopting the term matcha or mocha or malcha or however you want to call it in the future. Um, if you want to compare that to how people adopt and adapt to the usage of tea or chai or tea in different areas.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna see a lot of local adaptation. Something that I've been thinking a lot about is both Japanese tea culture in general. Tea culture, let's talk about Japanese tea culture and matcha culture. Where does it stop and start? Can matcha culture or even Japanese tea culture live outside of this context? I would say that like the Urisenke Foundation of people practicing Chanoyu in France or in Brazil or in the United States, right? Like they're participating in Japanese culture, right? I would firmly put that on the side of the line of participating in matcha and Japanese tea culture. But then what about someone at a trendy cafe in Rio de Janeiro drinking a matcha latte, drinking tea from Wazuka? Are they participating in Japanese tea culture? Are they participating in Japanese tea culture more if they're consuming an usacha versus a latte? Or more if it was hand whisked with the chasen versus batch prepared? And like where we
Mm, I
draw these lines as an industry of participating in culture.
I don't think people necessarily need to participate in a culture when they consumed matcha. It's like people in the UK drinking a Chiman Hongcha and adding milk and sugar into their cup. They're not participating in the Chinese culture. It's a uniquely UK culture, British culture. And I think it's totally fine. Like people doesn't necessarily need to carry the cultural heritage when they just want to enjoy a cup of tea in the afternoon.
Well, I would argue that they are participating in their own culture. And that
Yeah, they're
culture can be
participating in their own culture. Exactly. I totally agree with you, Ryan. It's new culture.
new culture. And if you zoom out, you can group this together. I mean, like if you just look at cafe culture and the culture of a third space and of a coffee house, I mean, how different is someone enjoying a matcha latte in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, from Paris, France to New York City? It's all this similar coffee culture, cafe culture, matcha latte culture. Like you see, like all of these quote unquote matcha girly groups. Right? It's entirely new cultural formation, as we recorded on another podcast. And like this idea of tea culture stopping and starting, it's just these different pockets, and some of them overlap, some of them are concentric within one another. But the idea of matcha culture being as broad as possible, I think, will lead to the most innovation. It's the most inclusive, and saying that all tea, all matcha that's grown in China is fake, it's just green tea powder, is not very inclusive. And I do not really appreciate or like this spirit within the tea community. It's protectivism, it's insular, it's looking inwards. Typically, it means looking backwards to justify one's own existence. And it leads to a less interesting world for consumers. And I think it also traps and culture in the cage and makes it much more difficult to expand, to grow, and to bring on new practitioners. I don't think it's actually very healthy for the Japanese tea industry. But then, on the
I
other hand, you don't want a bunch
I
of people
agree.
calling like a really shitty product, matcha. So, like, then you can protect almost matcha's quote unquote brand.
Well, how do you enforce that, Ryan?
I mean, there's also a lot of really bad matcha that's made in Japan too. I mean, let's be honest.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, like there's no way like we can enforce anyone from using the term matcha. It's already freed, and however people want to dignify it or bastardize it, like it's out of anyone's control.
Yeah. And, like, what are you gonna do? Like, especially with players that are much more powerful. I mean, look at Starbucks. I mean, Starbucks matcha it comes from many different countries, like from China, from South Korea, from Japan itself, and depending on what country you're in and the tariff situation, like, for example, it's incredibly expensive to import Japanese tea into Korea. Korea and Korean policy don't really like Japan very much, culturally speaking. So there's an enormous tariff on green tea. So to have a matcha latte in Korea, right, it's not economically viable to have a Japanese product. So you have all of that complication too. And when you have a
Mm,
company as
mm.
large as something like Starbucks calling matcha latte the same thing, whether or not it's made from a Japanese product, a Chinese product, a Korean product, or who knows where else they source from. You're just fighting an uphill battle. And then if you look at it from the small business perspective, if Starbucks can do it, why can't the mom and pop tea shop also call it, Chinese matcha if it allows them to sell it easier, or Gokuro matcha, where, then the burden's on them to do all that education and all of this technicality when really these products aren't fundamentally changing at the end of the day. Japan kind of lost its opportunity to protect this. And quite frankly, I don't think the Japanese tea industry and the people that have money and power want to protect it. There's so much money to be made in other countries producing tencha
Oh
to
yeah.
create matcha. Like it's
Oh yeah. And
same
if
thing with
this
gluten
would,
cap.
and if anyone wants it to be a truly globalized product and movement, I don't think it should be quote unquote protected. It's protection also means authority, right? It's implies power, and no one has the power over matcha anymore.
Yeah. It's too hard to top down decide.
Hmm, hmm.
It's a weird set of incentives, and I really think matcha is just a format now. Like, if you were to say, "How can I get someone to instantly understand that a tea is powderized in 2 seconds?" Right? Calling something hojicha matcha, or calling something black tea matcha, or calling something oolong matcha, for that matter, right? People will instantly understand what you mean, especially if you put some form of qualifier on it. So it's a whole can of worms. I don't think there is a right answer, but it leads to a lot of very interesting and different perspectives. And I think people who are very opinionated are extremely interesting, actually, on this topic. I think that there should
Hmm.
be a really healthy tension. And, I don't agree with some people, and we can still remain friends and have these quote unquote imperfect allies. And, it just all depends on what you care about and what like perspective you take. I mean, if you look at matcha in the past 200 years as a Japanese product, yeah, I mean, Japanese matcha is matcha, right? Until, a couple decades ago, no other country was producing a product that was even remotely similar or similar in quality or characteristics as what the Japanese were making. That statement is no longer true. We live in a very different world. So much investment has been made. Um, and places like China and Korea, what they are starting to produce a product that has similar characteristics to what the Japanese are making, right? That is such a different world than we were living in let's say, like the 1980s or 1990s, right? And then if you really zoom out 200 years, okay, yeah, the Japanese were the only people doing anything remotely similar. And then if you zoom out 600 years, well, the Japanese were producing a very different product. And then if you zoom out 1,000 years, Japanese weren't doing it at all. It was the Chinese, right? So, like, you can just like draw claim and legitimacy to whatever perspective you have, depending on like how narrow or broad you want to be and how you're trying to claim that legitimacy.
Yeah, I totally agree, Ryan. I mean, like it's back to my argument, right? Like the definition of this powderized tea has been very fluid throughout history. And right now, it just happens that like everyone is understanding a version of this product at this time that's mostly made by this very country. But I mean, like it might change in the future. I'm certain about that. Like the Japanese will not have any control over the evolution of how this product is going to be called. And honestly, I'm still team mocha, and I welcome everyone to use the term mocha for your product. whether
If
or
it's
not you
Chinese
source.
made.
Yeah, if it's or if it's made by somewhere else, like if it's made in Vietnam or northern Thailand, call them mocha, however you want. There isn't necessarily a culture of protecting a name in the community of tea in China, historically speaking, which is, I guess, a cultural difference between China and Japan. People welcome the usage of the term in other areas historically, like black tea or hong cha or green tea or even pu'er. Like people in Yunnan, they still call the pu'er like tea being made in Laos and northern Thailand or Myanmar pu'er, although it's not made in China. People did not trying to ban other people from using the word.
Well, what I hate about this question and about this whole argument is that the only way that you can defend whatever your position is, and, the position could be the base material, right? Is it fair to call something Gokuro matcha? And the position could also be origin, like Chinese versus Korean versus Japanese matcha. Is it to claim any legitimacy? It is an endless look backwards. It is such a pointless question from the perspective of innovation and what comes next. Yes, history is worth protecting. Yes, people have strong opinions, and it matters how we got here. But it's still an endless look backwards. Depending on how far where you finish your look backwards, you can arrive at different conclusions.
Yeah, totally agree.
So, and even our perspective is constantly evolving and changing. There is very clearly not really a correct answer to this. And the thing about, people's movements that are not like top down controlled is that like these words just get used and incorporated into the average lexicon and they start to form their own meaning and they already have, right? Starbucks didn't call it a Gokuro latte or a Gokuro frappe. They called it a Gokuro matcha frappe. And there's a reason why they did that. As it instantly communicates what it is. Maybe in a parallel universe where matcha was not that popular, and everyone knew what Gokuro was, they would never use that word. But that word has adopted new meaning to a large enough group of people that it is the better and more descriptive and more accurate word to use by most people's understanding of that word. Whether or not it meets the technical definition of how it's defined in Japan or how it's legally defined, right? These folksonomy, like the folk use of language, is that it has taken on this other meaning. And there is no going back. And reversing this trend would be impossible, even if you
Yeah.
did legally protect it. There's still tons of people, tons of travel influencers will go and like do a business class review and take a glass of prosecco and call it champagne. This fight will never be over.
No, it will not. It's by the end of the day a, linguistic science issue or a language anthropology issue.
It's like just
Um,
like pointless education. I hate matcha
It's
videos and matcha reviews and matcha educators that like the very first, what they use to capture someone's precious attention when they're describing what matcha is to someone who doesn't know what it is, spends the first 2 or 3 minutes talking about what ceremonial grade is. It is completely made up term. Like it helps them maybe navigate the market, but it is no objective truth or reality to what someone is. And when you're capturing someone's attention for the first 2 or 3 minutes, you're choosing to define a term that we've all made up in the past 20 years. It's like, I hate it when things start off with these types of definitions. Like it's such a pointless thing, right? But saying that matcha is a shaded tea that's turned into a powder that came from China that, is now in Japan. Like this is a much more accurate and interesting story than just jumping in to the difference between ceremonial and culinary grade, which are things that we've made up anyway. And there's no definition and there's no consensus. But even here's the irony, Sam. In what I just described, I said it needed to come from shaded material. And if you have like sencha matcha, right, doesn't come from shaded material. If you have oolong matcha doesn't come from shaded material, right? So it's this all of
Sencha
these
powder, oolong
contradictions.
powder, sencha mocha, oolong mocha. There we go, Ryan. Solutions.
Yes.
Mocha is really nice of a term because it has no cultural baggage. Not even the Chinese is going to hold you accountable for
Yeah, but
anything.
it's new category creation, and it's so close to something that already exists. And the reality is that people are just going to use the words that they already know. And then you're in the same position of that stupid person who's using someone's precious attention that it thinks that they're interested in matcha in the beginning, trying to define this new word that's a new category that no one knows and that no one agrees upon. So like it's still like we've made up this new thing and now we have to waste people's precious attention, which could be used to get them interested in something that they're much more primed to be interested, rather than educate them on a term that's made up and there's no consensus for. Right? Like
Well,
it's
there's no consensus from matcha either.
yeah. Well, there's yeah, depending on who you ask.
Depending on who you ask, exactly. But there's no consensus for matcha either.
From a
It's
consumer's mind, I agree. From the industry perspective, I'd say that there is some expectations that are set. But it's oh, there really is no right answer. I mean, even we're contradicting each
or
other and
yeah, or
ourselves.
even from the industry perspective, I mean, like there's a consensus largely for matcha right now at the moment. Actually, if you are Team Japan, like there is some sort of a consensus, but that's still fluid, and it's historically been fluid for the Japanese. So it's really we're talking about a snapshot of a piece of history or tradition that's not
Mm.
really a long tradition. We're talking about like within 200 years.
Yeah. And even if you really zoom in, Ian from Unomi, the really large e-commerce for artisanal Japanese tea, he was one of our first guests. And, one of the things that he said in his episode is that even the modern definition for what can pass as matcha would have never been considered matcha, you know, uh, 20, 30, 40 years ago. Right? Like the idea
Mm,
of a
mm.
bead milled matcha, right? Like that would have probably been laughed out of the room in the 1960s, right,
Yeah,
or the 1970s,
there
or
we go.
all of these auto harvesters or,
Hmm.
all of this new modernization and industrialization would have never been considered matcha. I think it has a different name in Japanese, where something
Yeah,
that's close to matcha, but not, right? Like, so even with
commoners,
if you
commoners powder tea. Like I
like, if
want
you
my true matcha to be harvested and processed by my 300 servants. That's true matcha.
or even like things that are like directly covered, like even like this disagreement with this in Japan, even within living memory, about what it can be considered, true tea or real matcha. It used to be that if it didn't from come from Togano, Uji matcha was fake matcha, and then that
Mm,
switched. This honcha idea switched from Togano to Uji, and that was considered the real tea, and everything coming out outside of Uji was fake matcha, fake tea,
mm,
right?
mm,
Like
mm.
it's there's no fluid definition for this. So I mean, is matcha a format? I Yes and no. It depends on who you consider to be the higher authority. Like which
it's
part of Japanese history, which people
it's
in
a
Japan, or do you stand with consumers? Do you stand with businesses? Do you
mm,
stand with the legal definition? Do you stand with the etymology and the semantics of the word matcha and where it came from? And even from this argument, right, depending on how far back you go in history, the definition is fluid.
yeah. It's an idea. It's a collective consensus or imagination of consensus. There's really no consensus actually, if
So
you really
here's a
think
question
about
for you, Zongjun. Is this a stupid question? Is this a
that.
pointless question to ask?
Uh, yeah, very stupid, very pointless. But, like keep I think it's also the fundamental driven cause of how tea culture moves forward that people keep asking themselves or asking other people very similar questions in history and how people keeps seeking for innovations or clarity or culture protections, and I think that's how tea culture has been in the past few thousand years, and I think there's no way, or I don't think this shouldn't be changed. If something has a really, really strict definition that is so codified and it's unchangeable. Like we're looking at a dead culture. We're looking at
Mm.
something that's behind a glass displayed in the museum. A true living culture is messy, is chaotic, and I think it's beautiful.
Well, you see a great example of this in France and wine culture. There's this whole wine
Mm,
movement here called Vin de France, or French wine,
mm.
and it's producers who do not follow the rules of their local appellation because they're too strict.
Rebellious.
And they just label the only thing that they're allowed to label on their wine, they can't say it's falls within, the specific appellation that they have, so they just call it French wine. That's the only thing that they're allowed to label
No.
because they don't wanna follow the rules or they wanna do more innovative things that those governing boards don't allow. And then it does get trapped in these cages. And now when see these AOCs, DOCs, DOPs, there are all these across Europe, these various protected regions. It actually is just like this weird rubber stamp of approval. And it's never excellent. I shouldn't say never, it can be excellent, but typically it's elevating the worst products status upwards. And if you're really great, you don't want to be associated with sort of this average case that falls within this protective status to
Mm,
form,
mm.
to distinguish your own product, right? So, protectionism also has its downsides, exactly as you said. But, to go back to the
Yeah.
question, is this a worthless or useless question to ask or a stupid question?
Actually, to continue your argument about this vin de France, I think it's happening to ujicha. Like people, like if you're really into matcha, you don't want anything that's actually just labeled as ujicha anymore. Like it's
Yeah,
actually an indicator of poor quality or like a fishy maneuver. Like if you actually want ujicha, cha from uji, like you would want to see like tea from Gokasho or tea from Shirakawa. You don't want anything that's just labeled as ujicha anymore.
true. Very true. We're
Yeah,
starting to see that.
that's how protection leads to fishy maneuver because there's economic incentives, and now the protection is bastardized.
Yeah, you get the blurry definition of what Uji-cha can be, which is
Mm, mm.
99, 98% not from Uji. And, there's a lot of misinformation about that too. A lot of people say it has to be finished in Uji, but that's not true. It has to be finished anywhere within the boundaries of Kyoto Prefecture, which is
Mm, mm,
a
mm.
much larger surface area, I might say, than the small town of Uji. So it's that's a different can of worms which we won't open. But actually, I do think this is a pointless and stupid question. Just like this whole episode, I will contradict myself. And I think it's incredibly important because it unveils what people care about across the industry. What brands care about, what consumers care about, what farmers care about, what producers care about, what educators care about. And it exposes what people are prioritizing and the hills that they're quote unquote willing to die on. And understanding their perspectives and their strong opinions tells us so much about all of the players within the system.
Mm,
And it shows us so much the incentives that people have for
mm,
promoting certain narratives over others. We can learn so much about this culture, the broader matcha, the broader tea culture that exists now and how it's changing. Even since we've started this podcast, and I think this podcast is about 2 years old. The stigma on Chinese matcha itself has started to really fundamentally change. Right? There's a lot more open-minded people, even if you go to places like Reddit, a lot more open-minded about the concept of Chinese quote unquote matcha and that it can actually have a good product, despite its well-earned reputation historically. So it's tells us so much about the people. And that's what's most interesting about specialty matcha movement is all of this culture to be unpacked. And it is a fantastic lens to unpack these clashing and contradicting, messy culture formation. And there's no such thing as culture formation unless it's messy, because humans are messy. And this is a wonderful collision of different cultures interacting, new cultures forming, innovation moving things forward, and people trying to anchor themselves in tradition. And it's a great lens to slap onto all of this.
cannot agree more. Human culture is messy, and if you want a homogenized, uniformic culture that anyone that have trying to execute throughout the history of human times, we are looking at some sort of authoritarian regimen, and they got overthrown every single time at the end.
Yeah. And I think, something that's worth bringing up too, there's always more to unpack. This episode's getting very long. But, part of and we recorded a lot of podcast episodes on this, but I think part of the reason why this is such a contentious debate is the Japanese government and has done such a good job both today and over time, intertwining Japanese-ness with tea ceremony and therefore with matcha, and how tea ceremony has been chosen as like the cultural representation of Japan because it encompasses architecture, flower arrangements, kimono, tatami, cast iron works like tetsubans and like kamas, like lacquer
Ceramics.
making, ceramics, kaiseki cuisine. It is such a wonderful distillation of what can be considered Japaneseness in forming the Japanese identity. Then now that this is getting uncoupled, and that matcha is becoming a category that some random teenager in New York City wants to buy at Blank Street Coffee, or that somewhere, it's so outside of its original context that it leads to this is why it's such a hot debate. And people, rightly so, I think, get very offended because of the very close associations with matcha, tea ceremony, tea culture, with the very identity of Japanese people, Japaneseness, Japanese nation, which makes it a really interesting case study of globalization and new culture formation and of Japan itself and the way that culture gets formed and spread and the good wives and wise mother policy within Japan that happened after the Meiji Restoration, after Japan opened its doors and became a much bigger player on the global stage, was this concept around creating a Japanese nation. And part of Good Wives and Wise Mother policy was to having all, female students at these girls' schools practice tea ceremony, live and breathe and become more Japanese and spread it to their children, right? So it's so baked into the idea of what's being Japan for generations. And I think people very rightly get offended when someone like a Chinese company fakes and makes counterfeit Marukyu Koyama and products and is fakely labeling that and trying to pass that off as not only Uji matcha, but Marukyu Koyama and. It's violating. It crosses this sort of cultural intimacy barrier of the way people see their own identity. And so I can also really heavily sympathize with the Japanese versions of this argument. So it's so complicated. On the other hand, right, you can totally
You cut
understand
out, right?
people in China who have no reverence for Japan for very good reasons, for historical reasons, who just don't give a crap. Um, right? They grew up with their grandparents hating Japanese. There's a horrible memory of all the atrocities that the Japanese did in China. And you can think of this as some form of retribution. I think you were looking, Sam, at some online Chinese forums about all of this debate within the Chinese internet. And um, there's some arguments that those people can make that, wow, this is nothing compared to what the Japanese did to us. But now we're still in an endless look backwards. So it's
Well, I mean that really transcends the discussion about the tea itself, right? There's
yes, it does.
there's nationalisms mixing, there's legal fights being missing. I mean, like that whole Marukyu Koyama and counterfeit, it's really illegal by any definition. Not even like relocalizing a culture in China. That's just illegal. And the accusation between two people from the two countries to each other, I think it's also transcends the idea of the tea culture realm. That's more, about the unresolved historical trauma between the two nations,
Mm.
and that's it's an interesting discussion. But for that discussion, I don't think there's any third parties that can step in and make any claims. That's very much not a discussion related to tea.
Yeah. Well, that's what
Um,
makes this endlessly fascinating.
yeah, And which it will be very interesting if people in China do starting to adopt the idea of using matcha to describe their own powder tea in the future. I would argue that there will be a lot of incentive for people to try to push for that narrative and trying to compete with matcha in the international stage, and that might be a very interesting dynamic that might bring everybody in the future.
Hmm.
There's so
Yeah.
much layers of so many layers of a complexity here. Wow,
Yeah.
such a hot mess.
It's a big hot mess. So you really can debate both sides of this because, like, even like you can argue, like, who is responsible for making matcha this national beverage or international beverage that's like on nearly every cafe menu in most countries? You know, it's the Japanese. It's Japanese culture. It's interest in everything Japanese related. It's
So
Japan who gave this
and
product its international stage.
and the Japanese pushed for this internationalization. They
Hmm.
were scared of it being not consumed by people by people outside of Japan enough, and the domestic consumption has been decreasing so drastically in all those years back in the days. They were like dire to push this globalization. Like the Uji government was incentivizing people to sell their product globally. They themselves push for this internationalization. They themselves trying to lift matcha out from this cultural context. Um, the Uji government was incentivizing people to add matcha into like confectionaries as an ingredient. We read it together from a document together. Right?
Yeah. There's a lot of unintended consequences of creating this market, which is saving the Japanese tea industry. Like you hear, especially someone like Mark from Oika, talk about how the West is saving the Japanese industry, Japanese matcha, because it's created a new market because Japan is a demographically declining country and the market is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And, you know, without these new markets, there's no one to sell the tea to. And now it's like,
Yeah.
now it's everyone got what they wished for. And now there's a lot of interesting unintended consequences that are happening.
Yeah, yeah. And exactly what you say, Ryan. Like it's so intertwined with the Japaneseness to the Japanese that I think it's what this whole heart feelings that's coming from for the Japanese. And if you are being as the Koreans or the Chinese, right? Like however you want to call this product, as long as it sells.
Yeah, but also the Chinese, like the idea of the like Chinese culture, Chinese nation, and Chinese people has not been so elaborately intertwined with mocha. It's not intertwined at all, right? That's like it's the Chinese have nothing to sacrifice or to lose by not protecting that part of their culture, right? Like if the Japanese don't try to protect that part of the culture, it's their very identity. They have something to lose. They quote unquote have like skin in this game. It's who they are because it's what it part of what it means to be Japanese is all of these cultural associations.
Yeah,
It's
but
the
that
gift and the curse of tea ceremony being chosen
but
as this cultural element.
Yeah, but that intertwinedness or incorporation has only happened for like 200-ish years. Like it's not that long of a history for them. Like the Japanese people has exist for thousands of years. Matcha has not been their identity for many, many years in the history. It's only happened fairly recently.
Yeah, but all those people are dead, like, you know, who had other things to
And
attach to.
and I would call it a little bit hypercritical in the sense that people don't even drink matcha nowadays in Japan.
Or and they don't know anything about it.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, well, no hard feelings, guys. You don't even want it.
That's funny for the average consumer. Do you know what's interesting, Sam? Is that a lot of the Western matcha brands or people outside of Japan, even like non-Japanese, matcha people, matcha brand owners. I don't want to call it guilt, but I think the best word is maybe obligation. They have this obligation to honor tradition. And like I think like nearly every matcha company on earth would agree with some statement like we honor tradition but are trying to move matcha forward
Yeah.
into the future. This is like 1 foot in the past, 1 foot in the future is like a very common sentiment in this industry. But there's this guilt or obligation or this necessity to honor this tradition, which I think is it's interesting to examine like why?
I
Why
think
does that have to be the case?
the significance really just lies on the gesture or the idea itself. It's the idea of I'm protecting or honoring the tradition. It's the idea of what matcha is. It's really not really about the tradition itself or the tea itself frequently. The tradition is constantly changing and the product is constantly changing. Like there's really isn't a old tradition there to be honored or protected. It's a
And
living
what does
culture.
and what does it even mean?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's the idea, it's the imaginary, honorific gesture that people perform. Wow, it's a performance, right? It's a performance. It's
Hmm,
just like Chano Yu. It's a performance. It's a theater. It's a stage. It's a demonstration of intentionality. It's never
hmm.
about the product itself.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that's true. It's a theater both for oneself and to prove to the rest of the world that you're not appropriating this thing and benefiting off of someone else's culture without, recognizing where it comes from.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
Interesting, like, modern cultural artifact that's so necessary. I think it's important and it's good in some cases, but the form and the function are separated. Like, the form is this performative thing
Mm, mm.
everyone says they protect. They honor Japanese culture, and then, okay, what's the function? Like, why? What are
Yeah.
you actually doing? Right? Are we protecting culture? Are we using chasen to whisk matcha by hand? Is that honoring culture? Is it honoring culture by just talking about the producer? Is it honoring culture by talking about the history? Where does that history stop and start? Which version of the history? The Urasenke Foundation approved history or history that comes from other sources? All history
Mm.
is biased. And, unfortunately, tea history has become the Urasenke approved tea history, which is very different than what if you look at primary documents that have been researched and investigated by other tea scholars. And then, like, what about it are we honoring? Are we honoring the fact that Japanese tea ceremony institutions are sexist and misogynistic, largely speaking? Maybe not explicitly, but definitely implicitly, especially by modern definitions, right? Do we want to honor those institutions? So those institutions change. How did they change? Who should the change makers be? Who drives the conversation forward? Who has the authority to drive these conversation forward? Right? Like where does Japanese tea culture start and stop? It's
Yeah,
so
yeah.
messy.
Even the sexism or misogynistic culture that we are accusing the Japanese society, that's also like fairly recently compared to the long history of Japan. Like Japan used to have female court members, female emperor, empress, and very like educated female scholars, like the author for The Tale of Genji, she's a female author, and that's arguably like the literature that people want to study Japanese culture. Like that was like a few hundred years ago. At the time, Japan was not like as sexist or misogynistic as what nowadays is. So even that is fluid. It's culture that has changed.
Yeah, I think people are really trying to search for meaning and add legitimacy to whatever they're doing. Whether or not you're a brand owner of a matcha brand in another country or a consumer, right? Like it's about building meaning and justifying an existence, practicing in
Mm,
something that is bigger and greater than yourself.
mm,
And
mm,
like I'm sure that Wazuka matcha farmer that commented on Jules' reel saying that matcha must it's like champagne can only be made in Japan. He sees himself as part of some legacy, something greater than him or herself, right?
mm.
Probably in a way, and that's where that perspective is coming from. It's a form of identity. It's a form of how you want to see yourself and the type of perspectives that you take in, which really make this not a pointless question because it really defines who we are, the way we define these things, right? If we came out with a matcha brand tomorrow and called something Chinese matcha versus Chinese mocha, right? reflects our values and our identity in the
Mm.
way and our intentions, depending on whether or not we use the term mocha versus matcha, right? And it can be
Yes,
influenced
yes,
by
yes.
how we
We will come up with our own definition and add into this chaos, Ryan. That's going to happen.
right? Like there's money involved, there's ease of communication involved, there's how much you care about consumers, it's your willingness to do education, it's how you legitimize that term and tie it back to history, and also how you square that and reconcile it with modern history, and how you reconcile it with the way you know all of these other things. It's so
Mm.
complicated. If is matcha just a format or is this other thing so complicated?
And interesting and exciting.
And so pointless and so just looking backwards. But it also defines who we are now and what our values are.
Yeah, I mean, it's pointless if you want to seek answer, but it's
That's right.
so meaningful if you want to seek a answer or answers from different parties.
And I guess the call to action for this episode are to seek people that have alternative perspectives as yourself on this matter and listen with open ears. Maybe you don't agree with them, but at least you can learn a little bit more about them and what they care
Mm,
about and be open-minded to the idea that they are part of this broader matcha culture, including
mm,
yourself, and that we should be more inclusive versus more exclusive and look
mm.
outward, not inward, and look forward and not backward as
Yeah.
these things evolve. If we talk about being just very constructive, right, it's important to understand who we are, where we came from. It's important to understand the motivations of everyone that's participating in the current, what I'll call matcha or current tea culture. And then we need to think about, okay, what do we want moving forward? And people are going to want different things. And I think that's a beautiful thing. But I think a more inclusive future is better than a more exclusive future.
I agree. But also, I think people should do pick a side, pick a discourse, pick a answer that you think you believe in, and enforce it, or like and disagree with yourself in the future if you end up learning something new and change to different sides, different perspective, and I think that's totally fine.
Yeah, totally fine. I mean, what if you were in a world 10 years from now and, we work with a Chinese tea farmer and we're producing just incredibly artisanal, hand-picked Longjing 43 cultivar, shaded for 40 days, with the last week of shading being triple layered, blah, blah, blah. All of these things, and produce just the most interesting product. And it
Or
tastes like the pinnacles of what matcha could be. And we take it to this farmer in Wazuka and say, taste this. We've made this for you. Would you like to try it? And he takes a sip and says, Oishi, like this is delicious. Where is this matcha from? It's from mainland China.
yeah, or even not shaded, but oxidized. There's so many like unique practices that you can do with this format of tea that is not by the definition of tencha, but like it's powder tea by the end of the day. And you do need to pick a name to call it. Depends on who you're siding with or who you agree with the most.
Yeah. But even if these people that have these well-defined perspectives and opinions taste a product like a really well-milled Gokuro that has very similar characteristics, sensory characteristics to matcha, and they taste it and they say, "Where is this matcha from?" Then you realize that it's all just a bunch of projections that we're putting on this poor plant. And it says way more about us than it does about the actual product.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, if you do care about the biology of the plant, you should not shade it at all. Literally suffocating this poor vegetation.
It's, yeah, so many different perspectives you can view this with if you, are really eco-maniac and think about the poor plant itself and just the ridiculousness of this whole debate and, the debate that we're having is such a much more a
Mm.
reflection of us than of the product because we've both tasted, and I'm sure there'll be more in the future, a lot of products that don't come from Tencha that taste very similar and would be indistinguishable from matcha. Outside of any label, context, can, whether or not you call it, whatever you want, that most people would have no idea it doesn't fall under, and letting the
Yeah,
product speak for itself. Right? Something we haven't
yeah.
talked about, and I don't want to go too deeply because it's already running super long, is the product itself. right? If you're super product focused, right, where does it stop and start? And to put it in the camp of the people that
and
only care
and
about the taste, right? Like if you only care about taste, right, and just enjoy the matcha, then you really shouldn't care about these labels, right? Because we can mill some mogacha and have it taste very similar to matcha. We can mill some gokuro, and a lot of the samples that we've tasted from that really are not that distinguishable in terms of like the sensory experience of tasting that matcha or tasting that milled gokuro matcha, milled gokuro powder, or product that comes from outside of Japan. If you really just enjoy the tea, why do these labels even matter?
Yeah,
But
but
I
but
feel
it,
like the
but even with the product itself, there's so many different perspectives that you can care about. Like if you care about the health perspective, you really shouldn't be drinking any conventionally farmed tea. If you care about the farming or the health of the plant perspective, you really should not be should be drinking all these organic product, which takes a sacrifice of the taste. It would certainly not be as tasty as
mm,
the conventionally farmed tea. So even the product side has different shades of or different parties that you can side with.
indeed, completely. That's that's super interesting. Yeah, and even the health, unshaded teas actually can have higher catechin contents, and they taste worse, but they're technically more healthy if you're just looking at antioxidant levels.
So yeah, really pick a side. I mean, like people perceive tea really back in the days as a medicine. It probably tastes pretty bad back in the days too.
Yeah, well, actually, the earliest records of tea in Japan, people revered the fact that it was bitter because they thought of it as medicine. And actually, one of
Yeah.
the earliest use cases and endorsement for drinking tea in Japan was as a hangover cure. It's uh, it's not at all the
uh,
cultural associations or why it's revered nowadays. Quite the opposite, a more mindful beverage. Also, too, I
yeah.
mean, if you use matcha to center yourself every morning, right, and it's part of your daily ritual, why in the world could that not be with Gokuro matcha, right? Like, if
Mm.
that is what you care about and the reason that you engage in this practice to have your matcha moment every day, your moment of bliss, which I think is a miracle actually of the matcha industry and tea industry in general that has convinced the entire world that this mess of a preparation for a beverage is a moment in Zen. I think that's great. But I actually, there's nothing zen about opening this can, quickly opening it as quickly as I can from the refrigerator so that not much air comes out, perfectly weighing in 2 grams into my bowl, making sure I preheat the bowl, but then I need to dry the bowl and then I need to sift it. And then I need to clean the dry powder off of all of these implements. And then I need to make sure my water temperature is perfect, my bamboo chasen is hydrated, and do this whisking for 3 seconds. And then I have to do, and then you got to clean up everything. But it's teaware. So, teaware you have to be more careful with the dishware. It's like if you look at all the other steps that people don't record when they take their video for Instagram of their moment of zen, right? There's nothing zen about it. I think that's great that people love that, but a minor
uh,
miracle of matcha marketing.
yeah. A refrigerator. That's certainly part of Zen Buddhism. Very important utensils.
Anyway. All right, this
Uh,
conversation is probably way too long. So to capstone this, Songjun, is matcha just a format now?
I think it's an idea. It's a fantasy.
Yeah, and it's different in everyone's mind. Everyone has
Yep.
different projections.
Yep. Yep. And I
So
think it's great.
let us know what you think. If you agree with us, disagree with us, what you thought of some of these threads. If you have alternative opinion or super strong opinion and want to come on, we'd love to learn about how you see this differently than us. And clearly, we don't exactly take a side. We're pretty open-minded. And if you're a longtime listener, you will have realized that our opinions have changed on this very question, depending on, what you're framing about what you're talking about and sort of what the goals of what you're talking about are, and you arrive at very different conclusions. So, a mess of a
Mm.
question. Thank you for bearing with us on this very long recording, and we hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you on the next one.
Hopefully a shorter episode.
Indeed. All right.
Bye bye.
Thanks.